Project Consultation webinar. We're going to give it one more minute to see if to give time for a few others to log on, and then we'll start. Thanks so much for being with us today. This is Cara Dinas-Dale, and I am joined with Kelly and Jason Jones, and we'll start in 1 minute. Thanks so much. Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks so much for being here. This is our consultation webinar, and the point of today's webinar is really to just check in with everyone, do a brief review around supervision and the various phases of engagement, talk about some helpful considerations, but more importantly, checking on your progress. How are you doing? Were you able to use any of the stuff that we talked about? Do you have any questions or concerns with any of it that we could ask, that you could ask today? That's why we're here, for you to talk with us about any questions or concerns that you may have about any of the material we've talked about regarding engagement. So just want to start off by asking that, were you able to use anything from our engagement practices webinars? So if so, what did you use, and do you have any feedback? You can chat with us over on the right. You can, I'm sure most of you are familiar with our WebEx system, but if you're not, over on the right, you can chat with us in the chat window, or you can raise, there's a little hand, you could also raise your hand and we could unmute you so that you could talk directly with us. It's up to you, but we'd love to hear from you. We'd love to know what have you used from our engagement practices webinar, what was helpful, do you have any feedback? We gave you a bunch of resources. We gave you feedback forms. We had three webinars, one on supervision, two on those best practices around engagement, thinking about the various phases. Were you able to use anything and any feedback that you have? Chat in with us or raise your hand so we can hear from you. Yes, thanks for that. That chatted in a question to you. I'm going to just read it out loud, because if you were unable to use anything from the engagement webinars, tell us what stood in the way. So Laura says, not at this point. I do not have direct contact with members. Okay, thanks, Laura. Sarah's using the brochure. Thanks so much, Sarah. Great. So we're just going to start with a review of the supervisory relationship. That's going to talk to you about that, and then we'll continue around thinking more about how to use all the materials that we gave you and take any questions or concerns along the way.
Thank you, Cara. So yeah, so we know that the importance of supervision is so imperative in this field, just in terms of being able to really do the work that we do in a very kind of quality fashion. So I want to talk a few minutes about supervision and how supervision prepares practitioners to really go out there and do the work with participants and individuals. And one of the things that's really key is the supervisory relationship. So the relationship that a supervisor has with a supervisee is very critical. And I also want to point out that this really does kind of mirror the relationship that you want therapists to have with participants, right? So it's a relationship that you want to kind of build trust with your supervisee to really help them through the process of the work that we do. We know that key factors in that is addressing the emotional experience of the human service work. And so just to acknowledge that this work is really, really hard, that working with individuals is very difficult. And so as a practitioner, you want to feel like when you get stuck, you have some direction and some guidance in terms of what are some of the interventions or options that you can use with individuals. Working in this fashion, really kind of working with supervisees to really, again, get their point of view and kind of talk about and discuss and have some dialogue about the interventions that they're going to use or they think that might be helpful will definitely improve the quality of the interventions and staff decision making, which is so, so key. Again, if you're talking about newer practitioners, this is a process that kind of needs to be developed over time because you want to help move that newer practitioner from having to work with a lot of guidance to really working independently. And even for seasoned practitioners, you know, some things are just not clear-cut, and sometimes it's very helpful to kind of bounce ideas off. So as a supervisor, that really is your role to kind of help them and kind of help supervisors to think through some of the challenges that they're facing. You want to enable organizational accountability and effective line management. So you want to be held, you want to kind of be held accountable for the work that your therapists do, and you want to, again, role model that accountability. So if one of your supervisees is having a difficult time with a particular case and they consult with you and collectively you guys make a decision about what is in the best interest of that particular client or individual. And if things don't go well, that speaks to, and that happens, sometimes things will go well, but that speaks to that you both have come together and you were in agreement with the plan. And I think from, as a supervisee, that's really important and important for a supervisor to role model. You want to identify and address the issues related to cases, caseload, workload management. We know that sometimes this is primarily what supervision is about, right? How many cases are you seeing? Tell me a little bit about the cases. But in good supervision, you want to help supervisees address this and really look at the caseload overall, but you don't want that to be the bulk of your work with a supervisee. You want to move beyond sheer numbers and looking at that to some more quality in terms of interventions provided to the participants that they're working with. But this piece is really important when you're talking about helping supervisees identify and prioritize. I mean, this is a piece that can't be missed, right, in terms of let's look at your caseload and see how many high-risk clients you're serving. And, you know, is there perhaps an opportunity for us to decrease your load because you have so many high risk, or vice versa? Is there an opportunity for us to increase your load because you have really mild to moderate caseload? So really taking a look at that and helping them prioritize that. You also want to work with them to identify their career goals. Where do they want to be in, you know, a year, 3 years, 5 years? What are they working towards? What type of professional do they want to be? And you really want to support that learning over time. And again, participating in coaching and support of all staff, right? As a supervisor, it's our role to really provide the guidance necessary to mentor them into being able to be an independent practitioner. Next slide. So we talk about coaching and mentoring. Let's talk about some key aspects of that and what's helpful, right? You have to know that the coaching and mentoring process begins before the intervention or service is provided. So day one, when you have a new employee, you should really have a conversation with them about, you know, this is the work we do. What are they interested in? How do they think they could be an asset? What are some of the interventions that they use? What is their philosophical understanding of some of the difficulties and challenges that families face? You really should be having a conversation with them really day one. What is your expectations of this individual? You know, how often will you be meeting? What will you be focusing on? These are things that you really want to kind of speak with the supervisee prior to them providing any services. And you want them to know that you're going to be a support when challenges come up. You always want to give the supervisee the opportunity to reflect on any work that they do. So you do want to provide feedback, but you also want to elicit their feedback. How did you think you did? What were some of the challenges? What were some of the struggles? What would you have done better if given the opportunity? So you really want to kind of process that with them, right? Because it helps in their critical thinking about their work. And again, you will also want to provide your feedback. One of the big keys that we emphasize is you focus on what the person did well. And this is no different from what you want therapists to do with families, all right? What did they do well? Or comment on that. How can they use that piece to move towards some other learning and for that to be a support in that process? So you always want to be focusing and emphasizing their strengths as well. You want to share your feedback in a way that doesn't establish you as the final expert on effective practice. And really what this means is that you want to have a collaborative process with supervisees. Again, role modeling that same expectation that you want to have when therapists work with their families. All right, tell me what were you thinking? You know, tell me why you thought that was a better intervention than this one. You want to have that dialogue. You also want to offer concrete suggestions that are practical and can be applied at the next available opportunity. Give them very concrete kind of interventions or suggestions. And then see if, you know, tell them to go and try it literally with the next individual they see or the next few individuals they see. And then you want to follow up and say, how did that go? What did you learn? And of course, this is great information for you to make course corrections that you need to make in terms of intervention. And again, you want to get feedback from the supervisee about the helpfulness of coaching. And if I mentioned before, when the supervisee comes in day one, if you guys have consistent dialogue about what your expectations are for that individual, and they have understanding about what they can expect for you, this really helps kind of strengthen kind of how they feel about coaching. Next slide. So let me ask you, have you been able to observe any of your clinicians, or have you been observed by your supervisor during this time? So were you able, if you're a supervisor, were you able to observe any of your clinicians directly? Or if you're a clinician, have you been observed by your supervisor? And A is yes, B is no, and C is planning on it. So we're going to give you a few minutes to record your answers. A few more minutes. Just waiting for the results. All right, looks like most of you, there's some that have, and some that have not, and then most who are planning on it or were unable to respond. So if you could take a few minutes and chat, and for those of you who had the opportunity to either observe or be observed, can you tell us a little bit about that experience? All right, for some, it seems like it definitely was a different experience. Anyone else have any comments? Great. All right, well, we're going to move on to some other questions related to supervision. And so let's take a few minutes and just think about the questions in this box as a supervisor, and we'll just kind of talk about the importance of these things. But how do you give effective feedback to your supervisees? So for those of you, and even for those of you who are supervisors, tell me what your thoughts are around how you give effective feedback. And if you're a clinician who's received feedback from a supervisor, tell us a little bit about what you find helpful and maybe what you find not to be so helpful. And take a few minutes and chat in the chat box.
I just want to remind everyone, you could also raise your hand if you wanted to speak with us directly. We could unmute you. There's a little hand that you could click on, and then Brianna will unmute you, and you could talk directly to us.
It'll be a few minutes for some feedback. All right, so Sarah says, going with strengths is always a good start. You're correct. An elicited change shock, what would you change? That's a great example. Usually people know what it is that they would benefit from working on. Yeah, that's correct. And again, if you spend time talking with them about, you know, what are your goals, what would you like to learn, what are your strengths, what are your areas of improvement that you feel, you gather a lot of that on the forefront, and that helps build a relationship in that. So when you're working on things and when you have to deliver challenging feedback or difficult feedback, that process actually becomes a lot easier. Yeah, usually supervisees present a challenge they're working on. Okay, hold on. And so there's counter-transference, you can identify, can work on them. Yes, exactly. And that's helpful, right? So having supervisees really kind of come to you and say, you know, this is really something that I'm struggling with, and really helping them work through that process. And again, building a trust and relationship by allowing each person to talk, right, and repeating what you hear someone say. Exactly. These are all things that help to start build a good relationship, which is crucial and essential in doing this work. And so as a supervisor, one of the things that I always think about when I was working in this field is that I wanted to be someone who was really supportive to a practitioner, whether they were new or seasoned, because I was thinking, you know, this is really, really hard work. Boy, would it suck to have to come to a job where the job is really hard and then not get along with your supervisor or not have a good trusting relationship with your supervisor. And I always would think about, you know, how that would impact my work. And so I think it's very important as supervisors that we focus our efforts there and take some steps to make sure that we're doing what we need to do as a supervisor with the overall goal of coaching and mentoring to get the practitioner to the next level of where they would like to be. Great, thank you all for sharing. I appreciate that. All right, we're going to move on to the next slide. All right, so let's talk about the importance of participant engagement and how that really ties into supervision. We know that initial participant engagement begins the participant-therapist relationship, and we've talked about this. And we know that successful participant engagement practices contribute to successful participant recovery, increased rates of attending initial face-to-face appointments, and increased rates of follow-up appointments. And so again, supervisors you're serving really as a you know, a crucial element in promoting engagement practices, in part because you're going to be role modeling some of those things that you want your therapist to do. And I can't kind of underscore how important that is, that when you're going to be asking folks to do things with individuals and participants, that you have to be willing to do that with them. And a lot of times, again, in my role as supervisor previously, you know, people note the discrepancies, right? It's almost like when you're a kid and your parent says do something, but they, you know, just because I said do it and they're off doing something that's completely opposite, it really does damage your credibility. And so the ability to be able to role model some of these strategies that you're going to be asking them to use with participants is very, very powerful. And so supervisors are really the glue in that. And so when we talk about participant engagement and we talk about how the supervisor strengthens the ability for supervisees and therapists to connect with their participants whom they're working with, really talking about all of the elements of engagement. If we could move to the next slide.
Yeah, I just want to chime in really quickly. Andrea made a really good point. She said that her supervisor was on the call with her and listening, observing her session via phone call, it seems like, and that the supervisor was able to direct her engagement process and suggest questions that she may have overlooked. So that the supervisor helps to model in a relationship with your clinician, but also the supervisor can help really pose questions and bring to light some areas that perhaps the clinician can do differently, which I think it sounds like that was really helpful to Andrea. Thanks so much for sharing that.
Yeah, and that sounds like a great process just for the reasons that you've noted here. Sometimes when you're working with families or you've been working with individuals for a long time, you kind of get stuck and you almost have to come out of the weeds to see the bigger picture. And so having your supervisor kind of sit in and kind of direct that is definitely very helpful, especially for those times when you really are stuck, when you think like, I've done everything in my bag of tricks to do. You know, a different perspective is very helpful. So thank you for sharing that. So we're talking about the elements of engagement, and we have, I'm just going to briefly go over this because we've talked about this time and time again, but really these are the essential kind of pieces of engaging. And so this can be for supervisees or it could be for participants. But we know that these are some of the essential elements to really engage participants and have them keep coming back and really putting all of these things into practice. It seems, you know, we say that, it seems like it's easier said than done because you have to kind of attend to all of these things at once. But this is definitely some of the best kind of practice models for really working with participants and really engaging them. And you'll see some of the key elements there is collaboration, strength-based, right? Also creating opportunities for involvement and learning, capacity building. So all of those are essential elements in engagement. All right, next slide.
Thanks, Yvette.
Thank you. So we did want to go over just a little bit on the research findings on barriers to engagement, as many of you may realize that, especially in the beginning during the initial contact and your first few sessions, you may just be addressing some of those barriers. And it's important to note that although concrete barriers are important, so things like scheduling or maybe even transportation, they're quite important and they may get in the way of effective services. Really, perceptual barriers are much more important, and when you're able to address those, participants are more engaged, they feel that they trust the therapist more, and they really feel like they're being heard. So if you could, during the first few sessions, really focus on some of those perceptual barriers, whether they're stigma or even getting into a little bit about their past experiences with treatment, that's really helpful. So we do hope that you use those engagement guides and really attend to some of those barriers. Next slide.
Okay, great. So it's just important to keep in mind those barriers. And I wanted, before we go into the engagement process, I wanted to ask our audience, we had a question I think was really some good questions around rescheduled appointments that we're wondering if anyone can give some insight. So Gisela is asking, how do people work with rescheduled appointments? Are people generally strict with these? Do they allow for rescheduled appointments? It seems that we have a high rate of rescheduled appointments, and it's a barrier in kind of the production of the clinic. So wondering, does anybody have any feedback for Gisela around rescheduled appointments? How do you handle these? Are you strict with them? Do you allow for rescheduled appointments? How do you reduce the rate of your rescheduled appointments? You could either raise your hand or you can chat in. I think these are really great questions. I think, you know, as a reminder, all of these our webinars are really, we're asking you to critically think about this engagement process. It does seem so simple. It's not rocket science, right? But it is difficult. It's not the easiest process. So we do know that if we can make some slight adjustments, that it can really improve not only our show rates, but also the outcomes an improvement in outcomes. Sarah says, we ask people who cancel and reschedule on a regular basis to consider walking in. So it sounds like perhaps, Sarah, you guys have, like, you operate with open access maybe a few days a week. Is that how you operate? And so that people can kind of pick those days to walk in? Or do you just have, do you just take walk-ins every day? How does that work for you? If you could just expand a little bit, I think that'd be really helpful for people to hear.
And Kara, I also think it's important that when you're asking that question that perhaps some data be obtained. You look at the data in terms of what are some of the reasons they're rescheduling. You know, is this an individual who chronically reschedules, or is it that, you know, folks are not being called until the day of the, you know, the day before the appointment, and then they forgot. And so I think to have some data around what is the reason for the reschedule.
Right. I know you, Yvette, in your clinic that you used to work in, you didn't schedule adolescents, for example. You guys just said, huh?
Yeah, so the comment on that is that we had what we call our transitional age youth, who are notorious for not arriving for the scheduled time, but would show up generally crisis and things like that. And so what we did was there was a select group of kids that we removed our scheduling model for. And so what we told them was, hey, we want to still service you, and we want you to come in at a time that's convenient for you. And so we recognize that, you know, scheduled appointments does not work for you. So how about you do that, you know, you give us a call maybe if you want to come in, you know, you can give us a call that morning, or you can clearly just walk in and someone will see you. And we would always tell them that depending on how they walked in, like if they were to call us that morning of and ask if their particular therapist had any availability, we would give it to them. You know, we'd say, well, she has a free spot at this time. If you walk in during this time, the likelihood of you seeing her is pretty high. Or we would just tell them, listen, walk in at any time. There's no guarantee you'll see your primary therapist, but someone will be able to assist you. And so we just kind of removed that whole scheduling piece. And again, we did want to see them, because we don't want folks going to the, you know, emergency room when really that's not at the level they need. But they were very crisis-driven kind of population, and a very, you know, they were very scattered. And so we did find some success with that.
That's great. Thanks for sharing that. I think that's really helpful. And I think it sounds like that's what Sarah does in her organization. She said, we know that there will be openings and schedules every day. Every counselor has about 2 cancellations or 1 no-show. And so somebody is usually available when people walk in. And if no one is available, then the manager sees the patient. So that's great. Thank you for sharing that. I think, was that helpful, Gisela? I hope it was. I think you're around your peers. That's also the point of this consultation webinar, for people to really ask these kinds of questions and get some input from your peers, and have this kind of collaborative problem solving is what's really helpful. So yes, thank you, Gisela says, great. So just wanted to look at this slide for a minute. You know, this is how we're conceptualizing our engagement process. So we have phone-based engagement and in-person engagement. And phone-based engagement is also kind of turning into text-based engagement at this point, and as our technology grows and people have various forms of communication. But the idea is that when you have the first contact with somebody, it's either on the phone or in person, and how critical it is to think about that very first phone contact or in-person contact with someone. And so that's what we spend some time thinking about. And then there's ongoing phone contact. So there are reminder calls that are really effective. There's been a lot of research that has shown us that having a phone call reminder is really helpful. There are people that are doing text reminders. There are automated reminders for people to be reminded of their appointment, and that's that continued kind of phone-based engagement. And then with in-person, there's that first contact perhaps, or there's the first meetings, and then there's ongoing contact. A lot of you were really struggling, I think, around ongoing contact, so we talked a little bit about that as well. But just wanted to see how this is going for you and thinking about this process. What kind of issues around the participant engagement have come up for either clinicians or supervisors? Are there any issues you all are experiencing aside from, this was great to talk about the scheduling, any other issues that you're experiencing around participant engagement that you'd like to talk about right now? Again, you can raise your hand or you can chat in with us. I'm going to keep going, but I'll look for your chat just because it's really great to hear from you and hear what's really working or what you need help with. These are the 4 phases of the engagement process based on that guideline that I just showed you: the initial contact, initial interview or meetings, and then ongoing services, retention, and terminating services. So we have a question from Sarah. Before we go to the poll question, we're going to hold off on that for a second. But Sarah asked how to do shared decision-making at intake when there's so much else to do. That's a wonderful question, Sarah. Anybody have any kind of feedback from her, for her? Any insight or feedback for her? How to do shared decision-making at intake when there's so much else to do? I know we would say that shared decision-making is really a priority because you're really aligning with the felt need of the participant. And if you don't do that, I know there are papers to fill out and there's a lot to do, but if you don't align with the participant from the very beginning, I think that really interrupts the engagement process. I don't know if anybody else has anything else to share.
Yeah, Kara, I think you're accurate in saying, we definitely highly value that piece, and I always equate it to this. You can do shared decision-making amongst all of those things and get some impact in terms of participation, or you cannot do it and not have a participant sitting in front of you. So it is very important, and I think in terms of how you're working on intake, remember intake is really information gathering. And so it does provide some opportunity to check in with the participant and the individual and see, like, what's brought you here? Tell me a little bit about what you'd like to get, out of this service. And if you start there, you start to intertwine some of what you need to know as a provider or practitioner with what the individual is saying or coming to you with. So yes, it's a very, very important.
I agree with that. I agree. Does anybody else have any feedback for Sarah? We really encourage you to also take this back as an organization and talk about all of the items and all of the resources we've given you, all of the thinking that we've done together, that you take back to your meetings, to your organizations to continue to work on this. I think it's really important. Sarah continues to say that we do CFI, which helps with getting their narratives, but what about talking about therapy services? Yeah. Well, that's where the brochure, we thought the brochure would be helpful to really inform people about what therapy looks like, and then there are, some organizations have made handouts about these are the types of services that we provide, that people can go back and think about what may make the most sense for them. But do you have any other feedback in that, or anyone else?
Yeah, I have some feedback about that because that's a question that comes up routinely. And so when you're talking about therapy services, I think one of the things, one of the important takeaways is that don't assume that folks know what services exist. So definitely going over kind of that broad spectrum of what we offer here at the clinic. As an example, we offer group therapy, we offer individual, we offer family. So giving them those options. But I also think that if you, for instance, if after an assessment you determine that, an individual would benefit from some particular treatment, let's just say, and let's say the treatment is 12 weeks, we want to let participants know that and make really solid decisions around whether or not they think that that's doable for them or not. And I'm of the mindset that I always like to negotiate. So I might say, as an example, it looks like you suffer from this diagnosis, and what we know about this is the best practice for treating this is a 12-week CBT model. And they might come to me and say, I can't do 12 weeks, right? I can't do it. I might say to them, okay, well then tell me how many weeks can you do? And they might say, well, I can do 8. And I'll say, great, we'll start with 8. And then through that process, right, of developing a relationship, of working with them, I'm hoping that I can get them to move to 12, right? But I'm of the mindset that 8 weeks is better than 0 weeks. And so for me, that's kind of how I preference it and how I try to work. So really there is some negotiation, there is choice and treatment. And I think letting families know that, you know, some families or individuals might be more willing to come to sessions for, say, a time-limited option like 15 weeks, 12 weeks, versus not telling them anything and leaving it open-ended, because they might think that's just overwhelming versus, oh, I can handle 12 weeks or I can handle 15 weeks.
That's great. I think, yeah, bringing choice into every step of the process, I think, is really, really important. So keep those questions coming in. This is great. I have one for you. Have you been able to utilize engagement guides? So part of what we talked about were these guides that really presented the skills to you around engagement, from the initial contact. This is in their 2 pages. First meeting, and then we have the ongoing contact, and then termination. Of course, we know that termination is often something we don't always get to. But thinking about these and what has been most helpful, and have you been able to use these engagement guides? So if you could just participate in the poll question, yes, no, or planning on it. We also have laminated versions of these in our offices. If you would like to have actual hard copies of these, we'd be more than happy to mail them to you if you email us at the end of the slides. You'll see kara.dean@nyu.edu. We can mail you hard copies of those guides as well, which is really helpful to have around the office, we've heard. Have you been able to utilize them though? We'd love to hear from you. If you have them and you haven't utilized them, what's gotten in the way? We'll ask that next. So think about that if you haven't been able to utilize them. Okay, so a few of you have used them, a few of you have not, and some of you are planning on it. So if you have used them, how's that gone? We'd love to hear from you. Are they helpful? I can always tell if they're helpful if therapists start sharing them with other therapists. Then I know for sure they're really helpful. If you're a therapist or a clinician and you're using them, how do you like them? Are they helpful to have around? I've heard some people keep them, you know, kind of beside them during sessions, depending on the participant that's in the room and the phase of engagement. They utilize them in various ways. But I'd like to hear from you all. How do you use them? Are they helpful? Do you have any feedback? Is there something we should change on them? We're always open to feedback and thinking about changing our resources as well. Well, feel free to chat in with us. We love to hear from you. I'm just going to go over the initial contact, of course, because that initial contact, as I've mentioned, is really one of the most important phases of engagement, because if you don't do it well, people don't come back, right? And so, as we know, the statistics tell us that it's really difficult because more than half people that attend their first session don't come back for a second one. So these are some objectives, right? So welcoming, I'm sure all of you know these, but these are really to serve as a reminder that you're welcoming, that you validate the caller, that you really express empathy and understanding, that you clarify the need. So it sounds like this is what you're calling about today, this is what you're looking for, and at the same time you're assessing for urgency. You know, is this person in crisis? Do they need to come in that day? Do they need to go to a hospital? Or can it wait a few days? So really assessing for urgency is huge in that initial contact. And then, of course, confirming the next appointment and problem solve any presenting barriers. So transportation may be a barrier, if childcare may be a barrier, if they've been in services before, how can you attend to some of those barriers in that very first contact? So it's not a lengthy conversation, but so there's a lot to do in a little bit of time, but these are the main objectives. And of course, keep in mind motivational interviewing. So Jason's going to talk a little bit about motivational interviewing.
Great, thanks, Kara. So motivational interviewing is a great first step when you're meeting a participant, and it's really a way to just gain some knowledge around their understanding of their readiness to change. So it's especially important during the first meeting. Research has shown that use of motivational interviewing during the first meeting is associated with higher satisfaction through the initial stages and throughout treatment. So we really encourage you to really use some of those principles, roll with the resistance, really understand where they are in terms of their needs, and really help them feel heard. So there is a guide that we are providing you with today. Kara, if you could pull that up, thank you. Right, so motivational interviewing strategies and techniques, and this really comes out of the last few webinars where when we brought up motivational interviewing, a few of you mentioned that, you know, just some specific things that you could say to participants when working with them. So the first would be asking permission, and the guide really takes you through some specific statements that you can make with participants throughout your exchanges with them. Eliciting and invoking change talk. So what would you like to see different about your current situation? What makes you think you need to change? And really highlighting some of their needs and the things that they want to work on. Can you move to the next page? Thank you. So exploring importance and confidence. So what do they want to work on first? What's more important? What do they really want to highlight? And that gives you a framework for where to continue your work. And then moving on to open-ended questions. So that'll give you a lot more information about what they're dealing with and how you can be the most helpful. What kinds of services can you offer them at your clinic or at your agency? And what do they really want to utilize? And of course, reflective listening, which is one thing that we constantly talk about, but really reflecting back what you heard, just to make sure that they understand you understand what they're saying and they feel heard. So we hope that this guide is useful. It will be up on our CTAC website, and it's something that you could really start using with a lot of your participants during the first session as well as ongoing throughout treatment. Next slide. So we do want you to remember a few things during the first meeting. Really just focus on immediate concerns, attend to past experiences with mental health services, so a lot of those perceptual barriers that we talked about before, and really how can you combat those? Encourage shared decision-making and really a collaborative relationship. So this is really setting up treatment from the beginning and really working with them to build that collaboration and that relationship. And of course, please remember the ARCH principles. Next slide. So ARCH, acceptance, respect, curiosity, and honesty. And this is just a framework for really approaching any type of participant therapist relationship. So we hope that you could keep these in mind, and it's really just a framework for working with anyone that comes into your agency. Next slide.
All right, so we're going to talk about ongoing engagement and what are some of the key elements in ongoing engagement. Well, in some of these we spoke about, so I'm just going to go through this very briefly, but we always need to validate and identify strengths and start there. Start with people's strengths. You know, utilize that to kind of navigate a path for overcoming some of the challenges. It's always a better sell if you start there than if you start with deficit. And sometimes that's difficult because we operate from a deficit model, and so we really have to make a shift towards operating towards a strength-based model. Express empathy and understanding. So know that all, you know, folks come to us with all different backgrounds, challenges, and so we want to express empathy. People may not see the world as we see it. People may not have been given the opportunities that we've been given. And so we have to be mindful to not approach the situation as if, you know, from our own experience. We have to be open to hearing the experiences of others and validating that. Encourage shared decision-making. We talked a little bit about this. Build hope and foster resilience. You always want to be the practitioner who does something different, who means something different, because that's kind of the crux of engagement and having folks coming back. You want to be the one who instills hope right? That there's a purpose. And so we really have to kind of work to build that. And continue to problem solve around concrete and perceptual barriers. Again, this is not something you just do at the first session. You will need to do this continuously throughout as life changes and things happen, and you want to make sure that you are helping individuals solve that so that it has minimal impact on their ability to continue their treatment. Next slide. So what are some of the best practices that can decrease the no-show rate? Again, helping participants understand the cost-benefit analysis of being in treatment. You heard Jason say the MI stuff was really to kind of assess where they are in the change process. And so you really want to give them all of the information, right? Discuss with them what you expect the duration of therapy to be, how their behavior or their child's behavior may change and evolve. The role that you have, what is your role as a therapist in working with the individual? And create a working alliance with folks, building a trusting relationship, providing empowerment for the individual. So incorporating their preferences into therapy, again, instilling hope, having them go out and do some things that you know that they're highly capable of, and then coming back and reporting to you and talking about that, and then utilizing that to help them grow and, again, overcome some of the additional challenges. Next slide. Treatment negotiation. I talked a little bit about this when I spoke about, you know, what folks are willing to give you and what you're willing to accept. Case management, you have to provide assistance with these very concrete issues. No one will be able to work with you if they don't know where their next meal is coming or if they're hungry. And so really we have to attune to those to make sure that they're going to get the best out of what we provide them. Appointment reminders, if you're able to do that, if you have time in your schedule, if you have some a no-show time, you want to reach out to folks. And sometimes it could be just to follow up with maybe something that you did the week before and say, I just wanted to check in, see how things were going. So if you're able to do that, that's a great kind of personal piece to really engaging folks. Motivation enhancement, right? You want to think about what policies and procedures that increase their willingness to enter and stay into treatment, right? Remain engaged. So more than just showing up at the door day one, you want them to show up consistent. And facilitation of the therapeutic alliance. Again, you want to foster a strong working relationship early in treatment. And again, you do that by all those things, giving them information, allowing them to have choice, make decisions, talk about some of the strategies, talk about barriers, all of those things work towards facilitation of a therapeutic alliance. Next slide.
Great. Thanks so much, Yvette. So I wanted to just check in with you about any concerns you might have moving forward. We did talk about an implementation planning guide. This is what this was checking in on. I don't know if any of you have used that. If so, we'd love to hear from you. But also, you know, what kind of challenges are you facing? What do you hope to change in regards to engagement in your organizations? What concerns do you have moving forward? We'd love to hear from you. Again, this consultation call is really for you and so that you can get the most out of our expertise and all the resources that we've provided you. But you really are the experts. You're doing this work day to day, so we'd love to hear from you and that you can hear from each other is ideal. Any concerns you guys are having or challenges you're really facing that you want to really focus on in regards to engagement? So we talked about rescheduling. Is that ongoing engagement really a challenge for you? We've heard from others that that's some of the toughest areas to think about, and how do we keep people engaged continuously to come back and get the most out of their treatment? And some of that has to do with kind of going back into making sure you're still aligning with their felt need and why they even came in for services. So that's something we really recommend that you do quite often, is going back to those goals, going back to the reason that they came in. How's it going? Have you achieved those goals? Is it time to create some new goals together? That's also important to think about. Okay, so some helpful considerations that we're going to talk with you about, and then we'll wrap up.
All right, thank you, Kara. So we just wanted to review some of the things that we talked about in the past webinars, and we really hope that you're incorporating them into the work that you're doing. And the first of which is really a trauma-informed approach. So as many of you know, many of your participants would be coming in having experienced some form of trauma. So really setting up that expectation that it's a safe environment that they're entering. And just remember that if you follow these principles, that really does go a long way. So setting up some safety, trustworthiness and transparency, collaboration and mutuality, so really making sure that it is a collaborative process, doing everything that you can to empower the participant, and really making sure that their voice is heard. Next slide. And the next thing is person-centered care, and that really piggybacks off of voice and choice. So the participant's input and voice should be considered at every step of the helping process. Really, please make sure that the participant's experience is the priority of the work that you're doing. So really making sure that they're being heard, their concerns are being met, and you're addressing any barriers that may come up. And this is where feedback comes in. So really, please highlight any problems that they are having within the work and really elicit feedback from them at every step of the way. R.O.P.E.S is a way of structuring your sessions. I believe we went through this a number of times, but it really sets up expectations for the work that you're doing. And we've used it in a number of ways here at CTAC, and we hope that you can utilize it as well. So in the beginning, you start with the review. So what did you do last time when you met? What were some of the things that they took away? Were there any action steps that they were to accomplish between that meeting and this meeting? The overview is really an opportunity to talk about the session that you have during that day. So what do you plan on accomplishing? The presentation is some type of exercise or activity, some type of information that you're going to give them, and it's really the bulk of the session. The exercise is actually doing the activity, so practicing the skills that they plan on accomplishing for that day. And then summary, simply going over what happened and what you're going to do during the next session. Next slide. Great. So the power of peers, and we know that you've heard this a lot. If you do have the opportunity to hire peers in your organization, or even if you do have peers, and we hope that you could chat in some of the benefits of having peers in your organization, but our colleague Ruth at R.O.P.E.S has talked about this a lot. Peers really make participants feel safe. They increase engagement, and they really make them feel heard. So if you can hire peers in your organization, we highly encourage it. And I think that you'll see the benefits almost instantaneously. And lastly, cultural competency. So in the helping professions, it's something that's talked about a lot. Knowledge of your participants' cultural practices really does help them feel more engaged, and it builds trust between the participant and the clinician. And it really comes down to two things. If you don't know, simply ask. Really just open up that set of communication, really let them tell you about themselves. And even if you think you know, it's still safe to ask. So we please highlight that and just go from there.
Great, wonderful. So those are some helpful considerations. So we encourage you to go back and use these things. We're going to post all of our resources on our website if you haven't seen that already, that you can continue to use, because one of them is the feedback form that we really recommend you use from the very beginning, so that you're getting feedback from the participant around how the session went and what maybe you could be doing differently with each other. So here are upcoming CTAC events. We are going to join again for the similar kind of consultation call webinar on April 7th. So please go and use some of those things and bring back your questions, your concerns, any feedback that you have. We'd love to hear from you. And then May 4th, we're going to have a final webinar around lessons learned and sustainability. So for those of you that may not know, we do have a parallel learning community right now around utilizing adult engagement. So we're hopefully going to hear from some of our participants in the learning community around the final lessons learned and the way that they're going to continue to work. We have heard that a lot of them are using the guides, the brochures, the feedback forms, and have found those things to be helpful. So we'd like to take the opportunity to hear more specifically from people in that final webinar and hope that you can join us then. So if you have any questions or concerns, you're always welcome to reach out to any of us. Ruth Cologne-Wagner, who was with NIAPRS, was unable to join us, but she is a part of our team, and she would love to talk with you, any of you who are interested in bringing peers into your organization, as Jason had mentioned. This is my email address, Caradina Sale, Jason Jones, Yvette Kelly. Feel free to reach out to any of us if you have any questions or concerns. And most importantly, we hope you have a wonderful day, and thanks so much for joining us. We do have one more minute. I just saw the time, and we do have one more minute. If anybody has some last-minute questions or concerns, we're able to take them right now. Otherwise, we'll say goodbye to you. But we'll wait one more minute to see if anybody has any last-minute questions or concerns. It doesn't look like anything is coming in. Yvette or Jason, do you have any final thoughts?
Do not.
Okay.
No, please reach out to us with any questions or concerns, and please check our website for all of the resources that we've mentioned.
All right. Thanks so much, you guys. Hope you have a great day, and we'll talk to you in April, if not before. See you later. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.